Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of June 5th, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the Climate Control Division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is author and historian Joyce Chaplin, who joins me to talk about her new book on Benjamin Franklin and the Franklin Stove. Joyce Chaplin is the James Duncan Phillips Professor of Early American History in the Department of History at Harvard University, where she teaches the histories of science, climate, colonialism, and environment. She is also an affiliated faculty member in Harvard's Department of the History of Science. She received her BA from Northwestern University and her master's and PhD from Johns Hopkins University, where she worked with renowned historian Jack Green. She taught at Vanderbilt University for 14 years before coming to Harvard in 2000. A former Fulbright scholar, Joyce has taught at 6 different universities on 2 continents, an island, a peninsula, and in a maritime studies program on the Atlantic Ocean. She is most interested in topics where humans and nature meet, including the histories of science, technology, medicine, food, environment, climate, and biodiversity. She has written several major books, including An Anxious Pursuit, Agricultural Innovation and Modernity in the Lower South, 1730 to 1815, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1993. Subject Matter, Technology, the Body, and Science on the Anglo-American Frontier, 1500 to 1676, published by Harvard University Press in 2001. The First Scientific American, Benjamin Franklin and the Pursuit of Genius, published by Basic Books in 2006. Roundabout the Earth, Circumnavigation from Magellan to Orbit, published by Simon & Schuster in 2012. And with co-author Allison Bashford, The New Worlds of Thomas Robert Malthus, Rereading the Principle of Population, published by Princeton University Press in 2016. She is also the editor of Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography, a Norton Critical Edition, published in 2012, and of Thomas Robert Malthus, an essay on the principle of population, a Norton Critical Edition, published in 2018. She was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2018 and 19 and was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019 and a member of the American Philosophical Society in 2020. Her reviews and essays have appeared in numerous national publications, including the New York Times Book Review, the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Wall Street Journal. Her latest book, and the one she is here to talk about with me today, is entitled The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution, published by Farrar, Straus, Giroux on March 11th of this year. As you will hear, this book covers much more than just Benjamin Franklin or his amazing stove. Joyce Chaplin paints on a vast canvas across time, space, and continents. She looks to the past to provide a warning about our own future if we're not careful. My conversation with Joyce Chaplin begins now. Joyce Chaplin, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me on this.
You are a historian of early America, but in particular, I know you have focused much of your attention on the history of science, and your new book does that. It's called The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution, and I want to ask you about that subtitle. But first, I want to start with a quote from your book, because it's so interesting. At first glance, people may think, oh, this is so nice. She's written a book about a quaint subject, the Franklin Stove, that people have vaguely heard something about. Obviously, your book is much more than that and much more ambitious than that. And I want to start with this quote. We now expect even more from technology, maybe too much. Electronic consumer devices are our friends, glowing presences that make us feel autonomous and yet connected, an intoxicating combination. AI is our rival, a hypothetically self-governing power that might do us in and replace us. Other new technologies are our saviors. Electric cars, solar panels, heat pumps, carbon capture, geoengineering, gigantic orbiting parasols that are supposed to solve the climate crisis without our having to make any other changes to our society or economy. which is very interesting because I wanted to explore that for just a moment because I think we're going through a moment, obviously, where we are debating whether or not there is even a climate crisis among some people. Scientists agree that there is. Other people, politicians mainly, say that there isn't. And they don't want us to have to make any quote sacrifices. So I'm going to just start right there with that because you put that right up front. You challenge the reader to think about what these technologies do for us, like cell phones, like our electric cars, but also the fact that this is about not, in so many cases, it's about not asking us to change anything about the way we live. So start there, talk about that, and then tie that back to the subject of your book. That's a long setup, but
Right.
it's so interesting.
No, thank you, because that is the heart of it, in fact. I think if you said tech to people these days, they do think of high tech. They think of Silicon Valley and electronic technology. A lot of times, not even the physical devices, kind of the software things that they know guide technology, but may not really understand. And I think even the harder technologies of heat pumps, not what people automatically think. Electric vehicles, maybe. I do think there's been, for a variety of reasons, a little bit more attention to what those are and might do. But right, I did feel that it was important for people not to forget that we are in the middle of a climate crisis. And right, there is no scientific disagreement about that. I got to point out that in countries outside the United States, there isn't disagreement really there either. Political leaders are committed to making differences and to guiding economies and societies toward solutions that will have short-term and long-term impact. So notable in the case of China, using soft power in terms of alternative energy, most famously with solar panels, but with other kinds of options that have really kind of resulted from that government not having a debate on whether there is a climate crisis. They just assume there is and they proceed from there. So yes, the United States is becoming kind of unusual and isolated compared with other parts of the world in terms of saying, right, this is an emergency and we need to really do something about it. I thought it was fascinating within this current context that we inhabit, that Franklin lived in a similar, not identical, but a similar context where there was deep concern about climate change, no debate really about whether it was happening or not, and widespread attempts to do something about it. Not necessarily in terms of mitigation, trying to warm up the climate, though there were theories about maybe that could be done, but certainly adaptation. And I should explain that the climate crisis he lived through and was addressing was the Little Ice Age, which lasted from roughly 1300 to 1850, a period of natural cooling, the exact opposite of what we have now, but no less serious in the way that it could really threaten human life and well-being. So several notable famines and widespread suffering from especially very, very bad winters. So yes, I did want the book to evoke the context and the crisis that we live in now by looking at an early American who lived through a similar period and thought acknowledging it and doing something about it were the best ways forward.
Do we know what caused the Little Ice Age? Was it man-made or did this happen naturally,
Um,
geologically,
no
so to
one
speak?
deliberately, I mean, it would not have been the case that it was done through human decisions.
Hmm.
There are a variety of theories about volcanic activity, sunspots, depopulation in certain parts of the world, and consequent reforestation, which can have a cooling effect on the climate. It was probably all of the above and more. There probably wasn't a single cause. But it is notable. I mean, there is no debate on whether something was happening then. I think scientists are nervous about using a kind of ice age designation because that has a technical definition
Hmm.
about a geological event. Hence the little in a little ice age,
Hmm.
not like the big glacial periods earlier. but something obviously was actually happening. And again, but Franklin's contemporaries, no one said, "Oh, no, 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 everything's fine." Everyone was really worried that it was too cold.
And it really was. I mean, it's as you say, it's fascinating to think about. First of all, we are all noticing now that our winters are noticeably warmer, right?
Right.
That not only are things melting, but places you're sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which I probably got a lot of ice and snow during Franklin's lifetime.
Mm.
Not as
Mhm.
much now. We know that, right? And winters are unbelievably mild. Spring starts earlier. Go back for just a moment and talk about this idea that you also engage here that we don't want to be called upon to change our lifestyle in order to fix this problem. How did that play out in Franklin's time? How does it play out now? I mean, because that's really the heart of this, right? We think technology can save us, so therefore we shouldn't have to cut down on gasoline or change how we heat or cool our homes, right? That there's this sense that we'll figure this out without having to ask the population at large to do anything different. That's really part of this, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And part of it is, right, people don't want to do anything. They don't want to make changes. Part of it is a sense that, well, why should I make changes if other people are not? Which is a
Hmm.
self-reinforcing problem. And I do think greater publicity for the efforts that are being done elsewhere to indicate that actually there are people who are making those changes, mostly outside the United States. Without making it, I mean, unfortunately, in the United States now, that would sound like a partisan point, and that doesn't necessarily really help. That's just a problem. And one that, interestingly, I don't think, I mean, another early Americanist asked me, knowing about the great political acrimony that existed,
Hmm.
particularly early Republic, and she said, was there partisan debate again about the environmental conditions? And not really. I mean, you can find kind of momentary or personal or very, very regional differences of opinion about what to do. But again, the denialism was not present. Nobody was maintaining the position that, well, there's nothing to worry about, so just go about your business. In terms of kinds of the sacrifices or the different behaviors that might have been necessary at the time, some of those were really kind of market guided in a way that hasn't really happened here, or at least not yet. So really, the problem that Franklin was, the problems, plural, that Franklin was addressing in developing the first of his five stove designs was not only the colder winters, but the diminishing stock of firewood, not having
Hmm.
fuel to warm yourself. Um,
Hmm.
and so a lot of people were interested in kinds of conservation. How do you make yourself warm using less fuel? How do you preserve woodlands? Franklin was concerned that not only was wood diminishing and becoming astronomically expensive during cold winters, but eventually even future generations would lack fuel, and conserving sooner rather than later was going to be the better way of managing that. Of course, Franklin keeps inventing different kinds of stoves and heating systems. I mean, I've documented five that he did. There might have been other variations or attempts, but five known designs. The first two burn wood in Pennsylvania, but the last three burn coal in Europe,
Hmm.
two in London, one in Paris. That's another solution to a diminishing stock of firewood and making yourself warmer as winters and other parts of the year were getting colder. It's not the solution I wish they would have done, right? That is edging into a kind of dependence on fossil fuels. But that was the trade-off that people were making. People had been burning coal in England since the Middle Ages, and London was almost entirely dependent on it by the time Franklin moves there.
Hmm.
Everyone complains that, well, first of all, I've never sat by a coal fire. Everyone I've known who has says it is just amazing at giving off heat.
Mm.
It's a very carbon-rich energy source. It is just much, much warmer. So there's that advantage. But coal smoke is much thicker, stickier, much more noticeable. Franklin is aghast when he moves to London. He can't believe how bad the air is. So there was a sense like, well, that is a solution. But if you live in a city, it's like paying this constant tax on city life that you have to breathe in that filthy air.
Hmm.
Um, they didn't, I mean, there wasn't a way in which they could have moved back to wood at that point. But it was making a choice and recognizing that not all choices were equal. Franklin and a later American-born stove innovator, Count Rumford, both just marvel at how Europeans are getting used to living in this filthy air. And hence, one of Franklin's attempts in his later designs was to re-burn as much smoke as possible,
Hmm.
diminishing the emissions, the pollution that would be sent out into the environment on a daily basis by everyone burning coal. And it's a very good aim. He never figures out quite how to do it. But it would have been great if everyone had focused on that problem then, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So he asks a very good question. He sets up a protocol for trying to find a solution. Um, and he admits that this is not necessarily convenient or easy. So again, a kind of open discussion of the trade-offs being undertaken on again, a daily basis, consumer by consumer, where it's a much more open conversation than we have now. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't go have chats with a lot of friends about, the trade-offs of heat pumps and how much did your solar paneling costs. We
Hmm.
come to that, where it's an everyday concern and everyone is aware of all the decisions that might need to be made. So that's another reason why I think his era is very interesting. How do people do that?
And what it all comes down to in many ways is, and I want to quote you again here in your introduction, if we are to understand energy, climate, and technology in their fullest historical impact, comfortable domestic spaces must feature within them. This is what we're talking about. We take for
Right.
granted now in 2025. I am sitting in an air conditioned office in Savannah, Georgia. It's May, so it's already hot and humid. And my colleagues and I joke all the time here about, and we debate. I always say the air conditioner is the greatest invention known to man. You absolutely, I don't know how people lived here without it. And you use it there. We heat our homes in the winter, and we expect now our domestic spaces to be comfortable everywhere, right? It doesn't
Right.
matter if you're sitting by a window or if you're sitting by the vent. If you're in your kitchen or you're in a closet, you want to be warm in the winter and you want to be cool in the summer. Your book reminds us that that is a new thing that came out of what you call the industrious revolution, which we'll talk about. But there's an expectation now, right? That
Yeah.
you should not be hot in the summertime if you're
Right.
inside, and you should be warm in the winter if you're inside. And this is part of the problem that Franklin was trying to solve. And that's a new thing, right? Because presumably in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1620, no one expected to be warm in January, no matter where they were. I mean, I
No.
think that's right. So talk about that, this sense that this is really where all of this came from, staying warm and not so much cool but even I think Franklin probably tried to tackle some of that, how to stay cool in the summer. But this is
Mm-hmm.
about the need that humans feel, or even not just a need, it's they're entitled to be
Right.
comfortable inside, regardless of what the climate or the weather is doing out there. Talk about that for a little bit, if you will.
Great. Yes, because that is a really interesting part of what Franklin thinks he is inventing. That in some ways he's not inventing a stove, he's inventing an artificial atmosphere, like
Exactly.
you or I are sitting in, or anyone
Hmm.
listening probably to this
Hmm.
podcast, unless they're outside. This is a way in which people were expecting greater comfort in everyday life, that they did want to be at a more regulated temperature indoors. And right, in winters earlier, it was kind of amazing the amount of clothing people wore indoors because it wasn't that much different from from the outdoors. I mean, you'd be
Right.
dry, you'd be out of the wind and the rain, and that's good. But the temperature might be pretty similar to what it was outside, unless you were right by a fire.
Hmm.
So Franklin wants to invent a stove that makes an entire room warm. And of course, the end point is I like how you put it, the kitchen or the closet. Either way, you're comfortable
Hmm.
within certain degrees of temperature that are artificially regulated. I got to point out, this is something that millions of people still don't enjoy, with increasing concern these days about exposure to great heat for
Mhm.
people who don't have access to AC or perhaps not even electric fans, which can help. The invention of the comfort indoors is a notable part of Franklin's stove project. It's also part of his science, that by creating an artificial atmosphere, he's creating a way of studying how the atmosphere works outside. So eventually, he's not just proposing an adaptation to the climate, a changing climate, but then also a way to investigate the bigger atmosphere outside. So the comfort is a big payoff, but also the scientific understanding of, well, how do atmospheres work?
And so, in the period we're talking about, we think about the fact that there's increasing urbanization in places like Philadelphia and New York and Boston, and even here, Savannah and Charleston, which, of course, those places were had to be settled, and I use that word with quotes around it, to be
Mm,
settled by white Europeans, cleared by African American enslaved labor usually, but they clear cut the forest in the immediate vicinity. And
right.
as urbanization continues across the 17th and 18th centuries, you began to clear cut forest farther out. So what you're talking about is, in order to heat these spaces in the urban areas at least, you had to eventually import the wood. And certainly, so this is the idea that Franklin is trying to get back to is he's going to create something that requires less wood to be cut. And as you say, eventually not to be reliant upon that kind of energy in the first place. But we think of, I know when the lay public thinks of 18th century America, we think of these just enormous forests. The
Mm,
idea that they're running out of fuel seems
mm,
ludicrous.
hmm
I think to most people, you sort of have to explain that while, yes, there may have been forests, let's say in Ohio, there was no easy way to transport that. We didn't have railroads yet, for instance. There's no cross country trucking to do that. And so, um, and you mentioned in places like London, the whole idea of this stove, and I want you to talk a little bit about what the Franklin stove was. One of the things that I admire so much about your book is there is obviously a real science and chemistry to the way you burn fuel in a fireplace or a stove. Anyone who's ever lost power in their house, who has a fireplace and you build a fire, and it's amazing how when you're more than a few feet away from it, in most cases, you don't feel anything. He wanted to invent something that would heat a room, as you say, without you having to sit next to it. So all of this, I guess, comes back around to talk about the idea of clear cutting forest. Um, was that really the problem that we are presented here? I'm assuming, of course, that it was, but again, it flies in the face of what we think of. You even get into talking about how many acres were forested, let's
Yeah.
say in Pennsylvania at one point versus say 1950, and it's fascinating. So again, it's a big setup. I'm asking you to talk about a lot of things, but if you can talk a little bit about the science of what the Franklin stove was, how it worked, how did you, Joyce Chaplin, I assume you didn't know before you started this book, maybe you did, the science and chemistry of fires and how they work, smoke, how all of that comes together in this book and in this person who's trying to solve this problem.
Wow.
That's a lot, I know. I'm
I
sorry.
mean, thank you. And I'm trying to figure out how to efficiently, just as efficiently as burning firewood, how
We'll
to
be
answer this
inefficient if you
question.
want to. Yeah, because I know I
But
covered a lot there.
I mean, it was astonishing to Europeans the extent of woodlands that they
Hmm.
found, especially in North America. And the further north they went, the bigger the forests, and the older the trees. And so that was amazing to them. It was like kind of colonizing Scandinavia or Russia,
Hmm.
places unusual within Europe for having that amount of trees. But they burned through them quite literally, quite quickly. So an estimate is that in the northern colonies, each colonist household was consuming more than an acre of woodlands every year.
Hmm.
And so as the population grows and they're moving across the land, acres and acres and acres, probably eventually thousands of acres within the colonial limits were being taken down every year. That's a lot of firewood. Part of this is an expectation on the part of colonists that they will live in separate households and burn certain amounts of wood. The indigenous populations, I'll point out, did not have the same capacity to burn through
Hmm.
woodlands like that. You can live, smaller populations at least can live in greater symbiosis with those woodlands. But Franklin, coming from New England, is very aware. Boston had run out of firewood almost within the first generation, and they have to bring it in over greater distances. Within his lifetime, New Englanders are bringing in firewood from really almost close to Canada, going up into the northern borders of New England. So that's a kind of crisis in the making. It's that amount of fuel is getting more expensive by the year. I mean, energy, heat, is produced through combustion by releasing the carbon that various forms of fuel have stored within them. So trees, plant material creates energy from the sun. And when you take that plant material and either eat it or burn it, you're releasing that energy for another use. Coal, because it's really old and compressed, very, very, very compressed plant material from an earlier age, is even more carbon rich. But it is, the sun is the ultimate source of all energy on Earth.
Hmm.
So it is through things like photosynthesis and other conversions of source of energy from the sun that we get energy on Earth. I don't know whether that's enough of the science for you.
Well,
Um,
and in terms of what Franklin was trying to do with his stove versus
okay,
what you
right.
would get from throwing wood into a fireplace and trying to warm your house, what did his stove do in its earliest incarnations differently than someone building a fire in a fireplace that was highly inefficient? Most of the heat went up the chimney.
Right.
He,
Yes.
what
Yeah.
was he trying to do? And scientifically, how was he able to achieve that? I guess is part of what I'm asking.
He is trying to imagine how you harness the principle of convection to maximize the amount of heat that burning something will emit
Hmm.
and put out into an enclosed space, that artificial atmosphere that he's trying to create. So, right, he's not alone in terms of trying to improve on an ordinary wall set fireplace, which is very commonly the way people heated their houses in this era. Because of the little ice age, everyone and their brother or sister is trying to invent a different fireplace or stove. So his two solutions are to bring the burning of the wood further out into the room. So his fireplace insert, the first design that he has this big iron lip that extends out into the room. So you are actually burning that wood further away from the chimney, where the air would just whoosh up once heated. So that's one design. He also is trying to manipulate the hot air so that it fills the room even as it creates pressure to force the smoke up the chimney. So that's the trick, right? You want the heat in the room, but not the smoke.
Hmm.
And in which case, again, the dedication to creating an artificial atmosphere is really quite serious. It's a ventilation system you're trying to create, not just a heating system. So Franklin is trying to create a way in which the heat builds up faster than the smoke can try to escape, thereby creating this kind of shield that is expanding through the room and then keeping the smoke from sneaking out into the room itself. That was the first design. Franklin then adds to this kind of fireplace insert that burns the wood further out into the room, an insert that goes into the chimney that expands the amount of metal that can be heated,
Hmm.
thereby retaining the heat. It's one way of catching that heat as it tries to escape up the chimney. And then he has two small holes through which that heated air can be forced back into the room. So it's a very early and probably not very efficient, I'll just say, method of forced air heating. But again,
Hmm.
creating that expanding force of warm air. So harnessing the principle of convection. And I'm sorry, I may not have said that that's the tendency of air when heated to both expand and rise. So
Hmm.
Franklin kind of walks people through a visualized experiment that you can imagine the heated air going up to the top of the room, and if that were the only layer sent up there, it would eventually dissipate, but you keep sending it up through his excellent fireplace, and eventually the entire room is warmed. So that's in theory how it works.
So let's talk a little bit about um, how he marketed this, because you great discussion about one of the first pamphlets, I guess, that he wrote, and I don't remember now if it was incorporated into an almanac or not, but this sort of how this whole thing worked and what it was trying to do, and it became that in itself became very popular. And the second part of this question is, were you able to actually stand in front of and take apart and see how a Franklin stove works? Talk to our audience about how many of these are still around and how
Hmm.
the word got out even in his own day, because Franklin was, of course, a printer, very well known. So how successful was he at all of this?
We have only his statement of success, but also the fact that several iron industrialists, I'm using the term industrialists a little bit anachronistically here, but they would have been called iron masters or proprietors of iron forges and furnaces. They keep making these, so they do expect to be able to sell them, even if in small numbers, which can be seen as a sign of success. When Franklin develops the second model of the fireplace, the one with both the fireplace insert and then the chimney insert, he writes this pamphlet and
Hmm.
self-publishes it on his Pennsylvanian fireplaces, where he describes other kinds of heating systems in use in Pennsylvania and why they're not as good as his. And then he gives a how-to description of his design that's interesting both as a statement of why you should buy his stoves, but it's also a kind of scientific treatise. It even has footnotes where he shows he's been studying the problem and reading about everyone else's designs, and he thinks his is better. He goes through various other ways to heat an indoor space, talks about why they don't work compared with his design. And then he has instructions about how you assemble and install the design that you can be bought. And he gives the name of the proprietor, Robert Grace. You can go to that establishment and get your own or have it shipped to you. Franklin, at this point, is running not only a print shop, but the post office at his house slash workshop on Market Street in Philadelphia. And he never misses a trick, right? So he has a fireplace insert installed there. So you can go in especially in colder months, watch how it works. A kind of brilliant way for a local audience to kind of sample a product and see it in action before they decide to buy their own. Now, looking at the business records of the proprietors, including the one that Franklin advertises in this stove pamphlet, they are producing stoves in small numbers. It doesn't look like it's sold more than in the hundreds, so it's not like there's a lot of adoption. The reason for this is the co initial cost. And I ran the numbers to see, okay, so in terms of the percentage of household income represented then versus the percentage of household income needed in Philadelphia now to install a heat pump, getting a Franklin stove was much bigger
Mm.
outlay. You would earn it back in terms of not having to spend so much on firewood. But this is a society where, in pre-industrial times, poverty was quite serious, and a lot of the population just could not have even managed to save that amount of money. So he was really selling to a pretty well-off clientele who would reap the benefit, but most people would not be able to make to do that kind of household outlay during that period. Iron is a very, very handy material for being reused. So, the amount of iron objects being made in Pennsylvania, which has this almost industrial iron industry by the end of the 18th century, and then very obviously becoming the foundation for industrialization in Pennsylvania. But it does seem like melting down. a lot of manufactured or wrought objects made of iron was very common. I'm kind of amazed anything survives, but there is only one surviving Franklin stove. Probably because as people, eventually stoves would deteriorate, they might crack, people might prefer different designs, and you could sell the iron for scrap. And I think this is probably what happened to most of the Franklin stoves. We do have one surviving example and a partial plate of another, meaning the originals associated with Franklin. The surviving example is at the Mercer Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
They have pieces of the insert that went into the chimney, but it's not an entire component, but they do have an entire fireplace insert from that era. The interestingly appears to be maybe not Model 2, but Model 2.5, since it's cast with a smoke dissipating slash in the back panel, maybe to assist evacuation of smoke, and also with stovepipe. This is circular cast, a hole in the top plate. So kind of unknown whether Franklin had guided those modifications or not. There are more surviving stoves that are described as Franklin stoves because they're based on his design, even though he had no direct contact with whoever
Mhm.
made them. So there are, I mean, if you go to museums, often things are described as Franklin stoves, but if you look at the date, or the place of manufacture, it's obvious that that wouldn't have been connected with his original design.
Mhm. You mentioned heat pumps. I will say I think you're the first historian of early America or any era that I've ever seen who in your footnote your footnotes you referenced Bob Vila when you were talking about the heat pump and how it could be used in Philadelphia, and you calculated what people pay for of heating their house now and making that, and I thought that was really interesting.
Well, Franklin is all about the practical knowledge. Poor Richard. So I think he might have
Yeah.
thought that that footnote was just fine.
He would have loved it. Yeah. And I thought he would have loved Bob Vila and this old house. I'm sure he would have enjoyed watching that. So, one of the things that you talk about, we haven't talked about yet, but I want to, is you make clear that there were costs, human and otherwise, for, again, to go back to where we started, this idea of technology, right? Technology is the future of technology, is progress. Technology helps, it saves, it's efficient. But like all technology, there were costs associated with this. You mentioned these places where the iron was forged. I believe
Mm.
many of them, you say, relied upon enslaved labor, as did Franklin for much of his life until he didn't. Talk a little bit about that, if you will, and also how all of this affected, and again, this is a big question, big topic, and but how this affected the indigenous population of Pennsylvania, of which Franklin was very well aware and had a lot of contact with.
Yes, awareness of how technology is produced, whose labor or resources are being used is, I think, essential. And as I hope we go forward using technology and everything else, I think we need to be aware of that dimension, which was quite apparent in Franklin's time. So, right. I think there's a sense that because Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers, it must have been anti-slavery from the start, but it wasn't. And in fact, wealthy Quakers often have enslaved labor or deal with it in various ways, even if they don't hold enslaved people themselves. The Pennsylvania iron industry, Quakers are very prominent in that. Everyone is trying to get involved. And it's just an omnivorous labor system. Pennsylvania forges and furnaces use anybody they can find. They use indentured labor, they use free workers of various kinds of skill levels. They use convicts and they use enslaved people. And the forge that Franklin advertises in his stove pamphlet that belonged to Robert Grace had enslaved workers. The records clearly show them by name, what kind of work they did, how they were rewarded for it. And it is notable that um, Pennsylvania, although it had enslavement and made it legal until the end of the 18th century, allowed slaves to own their own property, also to become literate. So it was quite different to other colonies that had enslaved labor. And this meant that some workers on iron plantations, as they were called, could earn overtime, as it were. And one
Mm,
man who was involved with making the Franklin stoves eventually does this just after Franklin's most intense involvement. He frees himself. He keeps working for the forge. And again, the way in which these places use just every kind of labor. He probably had a skill that meant that he knew he was valuable to Robert Grace. So, very open history. That people had kind of known about the Pennsylvania iron industry, but when I went in and look at the records document that that was true of the establishments that made the Franklin stoves, kind of iconic American things, but not connected to this history. But of course they were.
hmm
So, right, Franklin is already famous for that really interesting trajectory in his life where he and his wife had owned slaves. But by the end of his life, he's the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, supports that very strongly. I mean, he's very convincing in terms of making that moral turnaround, which I just want to put in here was probably guided by his wife.
mm.
Deborah Reed Rogers Franklin, who had probably been the person in the family who said, we need to stop doing this. So I want to give her credit for influencing her more famous husband to take this step. But in this story of Franklin's kind of moral improvement, he's all about moral improvement, and this is in one very notable way kind of important. But he never really explains where the stoves came from and the work of the people who made them. So that was one thing that along the way I think needed to be explained. That in the middle of a climate crisis, as you seek solutions, are you doing right by other people?
hmm
What are the trade-offs in terms of human justice? This is true as well for the way in which Franklin was completely aware of the land being taken away from Native people in what becomes Pennsylvania, especially the Lenape populations that had lived close to the coast, and then the Shawnee people further inland, as well as other groups. When Franklin says he wants to save woodlands, he wants to save the trees, he's talking about the woods that grow on other people's land. He lived through the so-called walking purchase that
hmm
defrauded Lenape people of territory approximately the size of Rhode Island by using fake documentation and a rigged race to map out land that would be taken away from them. A lot of those woodlands are going to be burned down into charcoal. And here we come to the weird way in which Franklin stoves do save trees, but not immediately, because the iron being made in Pennsylvania is all being forged with charcoal. Concentrated wood energy. So again, taking that energy extracted once upon a time from the sun and making it into an even more concentrated form. Charcoal burns hotter than actual wood. And that's what's necessary to forge iron. So all the ironworks in Pennsylvania are using vast numbers of trees, even faster than a colonial population would be burning them just to keep warm.
hmm
Now, again, I ran the numbers, and it does seem like an efficient stove, the Franklin fireplace insert, would eventually save more trees than it had cost to produce. But again, the cost of buying such a thing was prohibitive. So it's not a solution that is necessarily going to work for all of the population. So there's just a kind of insidious feedback loop that the colonial population spreading over this landscape wants more land for agriculture, but also more energy for various uses. And this builds up pressure that supports continual displacement of the native population.
the whole walking purchase thing was fascinating, and you even talk about at one point that the fact that one of those nations, and I can't remember who and when, but they challenged the purchase in court, even I think into the 20th century, maybe the
Yes.
21st. I can't remember, and lost. Um, and we could talk about that for another half hour or so.
Uh,
I want to ask you though. There's two things. You talk about the industrious revolution, that all of these things Franklin's working on, the industry that makes it possible, the iron industry in Pennsylvania, leads to an industrious revolution before an industrial revolution. And both of these things, you say, what comes out of this and what he's trying to solve are more impactful than the American Revolution, which goes back
hmm.
to when I mentioned that I want to talk to you about your unintended American Revolution in your subtitle. Talk about that, if you will, for just a little bit. What is the Industrious Revolution, and how is all this more impactful to those listening? Going, gee, we're
Yeah.
approaching the 250th anniversary here in 2026. Kind of re-examining this whole thing now. Um, what do you mean by that when you say that this is more impactful than the American Revolution?
Okay, I think I'll start with the Industrial Revolution first off,
Mm,
which I think in popular terms is the big period of mass factory production,
mm,
but also material extraction that made that possible, the mining of coal, also of iron ore and various other kinds of materials. Wood is also extensively used in the Industrial Revolution, and mass mobilization of labor. So, a really significant reconfiguration of material life.
mm,
Originally thought to start in Europe, we now think that a lot of these activities are being done in colonial regions, colonized regions as well, especially the extraction of materials useful to the
mm,
Industrial Revolution, but also some of the labor practices and the operations at scale, the extent of capitalization and finance. So that package of material things being produced, being extracted, being sold, kind of consumer revolution involved with that. So extending that into colonized zones has been an interesting way in which we decenter the Industrial Revolution, no longer seeing it as something that only happened in Europe, and seeing it as happening in all the neo-Europes created by colonization,
mm,
of which Franklin is a part. So that's the Industrial Revolution. The Industrious Revolution is kind of a hypothesis. It doesn't have the kind of firm documentation, or it's a little bit more amorphous, hard to pin down, but seems to be from maybe the 16th through 17th centuries, a way in which people started consuming more and expecting more, right? Also including expectations of certain kinds of comfort, but being able to buy certain kinds of goods, sugar, clothing made of cotton, other kinds of amenities that just made life a little bit more cheerful and comfortable. There's also an element where you're showing off as well. So all these things about a consumer revolution very familiar to us now. I mean, we continue to engage in these kinds of behaviors. The mysterious part of this industrious revolution of the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries is where people were getting the money to do this. I mean, this is the part of the economic picture that it's hard to kind of figure out. Were people working harder, longer hours in order to buy sugar and tea and different kinds of clothing? What was going on? So that part remains hard to pin down. But certainly those consumer expectations obviously flowed right into and assisted the Industrial Revolution, including this expectation of indoor comfort year round. So those are two historical processes that I think, we think those happened. They are real
mm,
phenomena. The Industrial Revolution, we still live with those consequences very much, especially in terms of the increased consumption of fossil fuels, but also just mass extraction of various raw materials and their transformation into goods. And I'm serious about these. We live with these consequences. I mean, the atmosphere has warmed. Scientists warn us to the point where we are at a tipping point in terms of negative consequences for not only the natural world, but for ourselves. And these are massive. If you look at what the modeling and the projections are saying, it is frightening and it is very, very serious. It is an emergency we need to do something about right away. Toward the end of my book, in the conclusion, I talk about predictions by insurance experts that
Mm.
billions of people will be displaced from where they live or die. So these are not, excitable activists or whoever you think might be
Hmm.
overemphasizing what the climate crisis will bring. These are the people who are talking about the actual costs, insurance
Hmm.
experts. And that's why it may outshadow the American Revolution, which I don't want to say didn't have consequences, serious ones, positive ones. But at this point, I don't think the American Revolution necessarily is going to be perceived as the event that has the outcome, and certainly not the negative outcomes that the Industrial Revolution will.
Yeah. One of the things you make clear throughout this book is that there is, as I mentioned, the sense that we demand comfort in our lives, right? We are not willing to be uncomfortable in the way that we think of people perhaps in the Middle Ages, both in the clothes that they wore. You mentioned cotton, ever increasing synthetic materials that are soft that we want to wear all the time. We want our technology to be right there. We don't want to pay a price for any of this. Uh, and the American Revolution may have unleashed the energies, economic and otherwise, that made so much of this possible. But at the end of the day, it brought, there's a consequence for it, right? As you say, because if, in fact, in 50 years, New York is going to be as warm as Savannah is right now on a
Mm,
yearly basis, none of those expectations of comfort and technology are going to abate, right? Those people in New York are going to want to be as cool as we are in Savannah in 50
right.
years. And that means more air conditioning. And how do we produce that energy? And it's this vicious cycle that you talk about. That again, I think someone coming to this book thinking, oh, this is going to be a quaint story about a Franklin
Yeah,
stove.
right.
But there's much more at stake here that you really guide the reader along to the idea that all of these things have consequences. I think the most startling thing for some people will be that there was a little ice age going on just 150 years ago, or now 200 years
Mm.
ago. But really, there's so much more that you're trying to get at in this book. Have you found audiences to be receptive to this? Have you talked to readers
Mm.
who feel like, what are you trying to do to Ben Franklin or otherwise, that sort of thing? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, let's just not play games. We live in highly partisan times. You're making in some cases a very what would you, as you said, would be considered a very political or partisan statement, because in this country, even acknowledging the idea that the climate is changing and in a way that's not good is highly contestable.
Yes. I
Again,
do
a big
think.
setup there. Sorry.
Right, yeah, yeah, yeah. And here I go back to the fact that there is consensus in the scientific community, and there is consensus politically beyond the United States,
Hmm.
that this is real. No one is exaggerating anything. And I just referred to, the latest modeling. All the modeling gets worse. In a sense, the warnings that were said 2 years ago even now seem mild. So nothing is getting better. And this is why it's an emergency. It's not something that can wait. There are polls in the United States asking whether people are concerned about climate change. And actually, often people say they are, but they'll rank it lower than other priorities. Yeah, we'll get around to that. Looking globally, it does seem that there is, on that scale, an even stronger consensus that something is happening and that political leaders really need to do something. I don't know. I'm sorry. I think the latest prediction is that 89% of people in the world acknowledge that climate change is a serious problem. That probably, I don't know what percentage in the United States, but it would be lower. So having the United States, and here I will say, having Benjamin Franklin's country and nation that he created be the outlier in this just seems to me very odd, right? And I agree that using an iconic founder and one that often people think they think of Franklin as a kind of twinkly-eyed grandfather figure, very mild, filled with common sense, and they don't necessarily have a harder edged understanding of him. I think during his lifetime, the fact that he was a science icon, that he stood for that kind of knowledge, would have given him a kind of firmer, harder, more authoritative persona than he has now. So it is a science that matters here in terms of interpreting him. And I'm a historian. I need to say, well, what was the story at the time? And obviously, I did that in an awareness of how it reads now. And I agree, it's not going to be popular with everyone, but I didn't think it was a good idea to suppress any of the story, to talk about it in a way that pulled any punches. And what I often end up talking about with people is, I don't know. I don't know whether some people might have wanted me to just keep quiet about it. Just
Hmm.
don't, just, sorry, just don't say that. But I have to emphasize to people that I didn't put anything in there that didn't actually happen. He did invent stoves in his awareness of a climate crisis going on at the time. That was just the context. He did it in order to understand not only an artificial atmosphere in the room, but the actual atmosphere and climate outside. So he was a climate scientist, which also within the United States at this time doesn't strike everyone as being a compliment to him, but that's what he was.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I don't know, Stan, about I could go back and question each of my smaller decisions. Um, but I think the big decision was doing the project at all, right?
Yes,
And
right,
so
right. Yeah.
forward I went.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I applaud you for that. Because one of the things you've done is really what I think we want the best history to do, public or otherwise, is that you've connected the past to the present. You've made it relevant for our lives today. You've made us understand, or at least confronted us with the idea that we cannot escape the choices that people in the past made. The people in the future will not be able to escape the choices we are making right now. And so you've asked us to think deeply about that, and I think that's very important. Your book kind of ends with a plea and a warning. I think that it would do well for most of us to think about. We could talk for another hour, Joyce Chaplin. It's been a real pleasure to have you on here. This book, like all of your books, is really deeply researched, beautifully written. It raises questions as many as it answers, is thought provoking, and I cannot recommend it enough. It's called The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution. It was published by Farrar, Straus, Giroux on March 11th of this year. Joyce Chaplin, continued good luck as you talk about this. I know there are more books coming. You're one of the most prolific historians in the business today, and continued good luck with everything you're working on.
Thank you so much, Stan. Thank you for inviting me to be on the program and for the exhortation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. My thanks to Joyce Chaplin for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about her book at us.macmillan.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Krellin. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar podcasts about great books and the authors who write them, like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.